as promised, we are going to cover one of the strangest phenomena in the domain of resonance and frequencies. This topic has been somewhat made obscure for a long period of time. It's a weird one. It's very strange. It's super important for you to have an understanding of this because it does and will affect you. Now, this video is going to be brief. In the comments section below, you'll find a link so you can examine the content that I'll be stepping through quickly in this video. But this is a weird one. Some of it's going to be a little bit disturbing, a little bit freaky, and other parts of it are going to be, frankly, euphoric. It'll make you happy. You'll feel joyful. You'll probably have a greater sense of a grasp on your reality, and you'll probably end up feeling that there's something that you can do practically and functionally to get your life into a better space, on a better track. Now, before I dive into this, I want to just share an excerpt from an excellent link that I read recently by a fellow I hadn't heard of before. His name is Jason Christoff, and I've checked out his website. I really like the content there. I don't agree with, just because someone makes a discovery in science that may have real tangible value, I don't personally always agree with the associated philosophy that kind of goes along with this, with their discovery. I try to parse or separate out the scientific fact from what they might believe about it. In the case of Jason, his philosophy looks pretty good to me. As I went through his site, and I recommend that you check out his site. He's got some really good content there. Now, he's a coach for self-improvement, but he has a scientific mind, obviously. I'm just going to read an excerpt from this article. Now, this excerpt is going to sound a bit scary. Don't despair, because we're going to cover a bit more in depth, but I just want to get this concept out to you. For our senior members, this kind of process or idea you're probably already somewhat familiar with because we've been doing a lot of research into it for some time. But I like what Jason did here to just kind of encapsulate and summarize this. So I'm just going to read this. If you study what's called the 100th monkey syndrome or 100th monkey effect, Japanese researchers found that the animal brain or mind is the original cell phone tower. What's taken in through the eyes or any of the other four senses is broadcast out through the head, like a cell phone tower transmission. The brain or mind of each species can also receive information as well as transmit information. The monkeys studied by the Japanese researchers found that the monkeys of the same species picked up the transmission of other monkeys. If the monkeys broadcasting the original transmission were thinking the same way as a group, the size of the group needed to dominate the other monkeys with a broadcast spell. This appeared to be 100 in order for all the other similar monkeys around the world to receive the broadcast and start thinking or doing the same thing as the original group of 100. Each animal species shares information like this. We are the original wireless internet between each other. What this means is that if you get a group of 100 or more of the same species viewing the same thing, or thinking the same thing, or doing the same thing, every other member of that species gets the download. This download of information, frequency, and vibration affects the entire species like they were thinking, viewing, or doing it themselves directly in real time. This is all proven as fact in documented research and also in the way our black magic sorcerers rule us from the screen. Now, as soon as I saw Jason's excellent take on this, I had all kinds of bells go off in my mind. I knew what he was saying was true because it clocked with stuff that we've been studying and researching ourselves for well over a decade now. Now, the article, this is just an excerpt from his article. I encourage you to check that out because it's super interesting. Now, his take on that is that this process is happening when they're doing mass media, broadcasts. And it's a really awesome article. I just pulled a small excerpt from it, but you should check that out. And it's basically, he's saying that there's a form of the physical transfer of information, essentially through the air, that can affect people and get them to act, basically as a group mind. And if it was done with negative intention, then we're looking at potential damage and injury. So the trick is, how do we understand exactly what's being broadcast, and how can we protect against that, or how can we recover damage from that? Now, what this is related to is something called eidetic resonance. And eidetic resonance is something that has not been, unfortunately, properly addressed or fully explored, examined, studied, and applied within most scientific, including the alternate fringe scientific domain at large. There's only been like a small handful of people that have really studied it. And it definitely travels or transmits in a certain way. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. This principle can happen on a microscopic basis, but it also looks like it can happen at a macroscopic basis. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But on the microscopic basis, we have individuals like Dr. George Merkel, who discovered what appeared to be nano-sized machinery that would form in the environment of the bloodstream. Now, again, I don't agree necessarily with all of Merkel's associations to the meaning behind his discoveries, but it's very obvious that he's discovered something really significant. And again, there's links in the comments section. You can explore this further. I'm just going to step through it. But basically, eidetics is how an idea in the mind, or a principle in consciousness, or how emotions actually form from the space of the mind into physical reality. And then we've also got, and this is just one example, one of the problems that's happened is that when these individual researchers have discovered this kind of phenomena, there's not enough crosstalk that happens within the related disciplines or across different disciplines to really get a handle on that. So my goal here is to try to synthesize this in a really easy, simple, straightforward fashion so you can kind of get the idea. So Dr. Harvey Bigelsen on the left here discovered that emotions and physical trauma can represent in actual structure and form on a microscopic level in the bloodstream. So in other words, if you're having, like, here's a state of worry. Now this might seem outlandish, but as you examine the data and the contents and the samples, I think you're going to be just like really blown away. But what Dr. Harvey Bigelsen and his extended team have found over a very long period of time, doing one heck of a lot of tests, was that there would be a formation of a crystalline deposit within the bloodstream that could be examined, and that often it would be that the form that it would take would represent specifically what was going on in the body, and that there was a uniformity across people tested. So the same basic kind of object would pop up in people that had, say, the same kind of condition. As an example, here's a person that has tapeworm. What you're seeing here, this is not a tapeworm. This is just a formation of background material in the bloodstream that through resonance of the presence of the tapeworm in the body, it actually crystallized into form. We're also going to talk really quickly about something called sonic bloom, where we have a transfer of energy from different kinds of shapes. So here's a violin that would literally resonate with the shape of the mitochondrion. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to cover another fellow here, Michael Theroux, who I'm a huge fan of. What he says is that this kind of information, and remember, I'm tying this all back to what Jason talked about. So you basically get 100 monkeys, they all get influenced to have a certain idea in their head, and then once you reach that ceiling, what happens is that influence extends invisibly through resonant vibration to larger groups of the same species. So this can be used for bad or for good. And the process, I'm saying a part of the process that this is functioning in is eidetic resonance. So when we talk about eidetic resonance, we're just talking about what we call an eidoform, which is basically just a picture. And it's literally like usually a three-dimensional, sometimes two-dimensional object. And that the object is literally a depiction of the idea that's in our head, and or some kind of physical object that has its own information field that we're interacting with. So he says that this information is transmitted longitudinally, point to point. Now the reason that's important is because that mode of transmission is very fast. So if you had 100 monkeys that got influenced with an idea and then it spread to a much larger group within their species, it would happen very quickly. Now, Theroux talks about the communication, the eidetic picture is converted into a form suitable for transmission, and then the coding being the method of conversion, and the modulation, which is the pattern, which represents the information, would change in the parameters of the emission serving as the carrier. And for reception, one would simply reverse this process. All that basically means is just that there are parameters that are involved with modulating the eidetic picture, which is the information, and that this process is reversible, so it can be sent or received. So basically an idea in a person's mind can physically broadcast out and can be physically received. So I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit. I've provided a bunch of links to get up to date on that. There's also a link for blood anomalies. Some of these are just outstanding. You should definitely check out the Bigelson site directly. Here's a particular case where the person's spine is having an issue, and then there's a formation of the spine as a very tiny particle in the bloodstream, which is basically a holographic image of the condition. And then there's a whole bunch of samples to check out. Here's a formation in the bloodstream of a problem with the person's colon. In this case, we have a fractured femur, and we see this crystalline holographic image showing up in the blood. So there's quite a lot of these. And then we're going to talk about Merkel. Now, Merkel was the one that discovered this tiny machinery. And I would urge you to read up on this text. But when he was doing his examination of the blood, he found absolutely remarkable artifacts. Now, this is a particularly interesting one. You don't usually get pentagonal type crystals forming a lot in nature. They're not like a common crystal formation, so that's unusual. But a lot of what's happening with Merkel's images is we see a symbolic representation of an idea, and or some kind of machine-like process. Now this thing apparently shows up a lot, and it literally looks like a little machine. His claim is that it's been in our bloodstream for some time, and he describes essentially why it's in the bloodstream and what it's doing. I'm not going to get into all the details of that because I have full respect for Merkel. I mean, he has all kinds of patents. His science was amazing. I don't agree with all of his philosophical associations, but I do agree basically with some of his premises. So he's an important person to note on our journey here. Now, the thing with sonic bloom was that we see the same basic process of resonance affecting things like physical systemic cycles, like so metabolism, expelling waste, creating proteins, gene expression, the change of energy that is being produced by mitochondria, so how much ATP is being produced. But one of the things that Dan Carlson found was that certain frequency vibrations in the mitochondria of plants would stimulate them into either growth or disease. And this is also a really important step on our journey, where you have essentially, a table of correspondence type idea. An interesting notion from the ancient Orient was that certain plants, if they had the shape of a part of the body, then they thought that it would be, good for the body. So, for example, if you were a key practitioner, or a martial arts practitioner that was studying things like five element theory, et cetera, et cetera, one of the things that they would do is they would correspond certain kinds of beans that they would eat to their kidneys, thinking that the energy in the kidneys would increase if they ate these kinds of beans. So it's that sort of sympathetic resonance idea. We see that happening in Dan Carlson's work. And what's interesting is that we're now seeing in current technology the implementation of creating three-dimensional structures or forms with sound. And then I also want to introduce you to Megan Watts Hughes, who took the informational sound field of her voice and created some pretty astounding imagery. And I've thrown in a couple of other references here. This is a Michael Tellinger video. Very important to review that. I made a brief reference to the Silva method. Now, I'm not a Silva method practitioner. I'm not really sure if I'm on board with their philosophy. Some of their notions are worth checking out. Talks about the electrical activity of the brain and how that actually affects our mind state. I also want to talk about holoenergetics. Holoenergetics is one of the few current, and again, I'm not sure if I'm on board with everything that they talk about, but they have some interesting notions. They address parts of the idea or ideas related to this. Now, when we talk about iodoforms, some of you may have seen this before. We see this kind of like anthropomorphic, perceived shape in the physical structure of a plant. But I want to point something out here. It would be really easy to dismiss this as a form of pareidolia, where there's a confusion of the senses, where a pattern is thought to be perceived versus, if something's really there. And so one of the things that can happen is we can see in natural formations, instead of on a microscopic level, we can see on a macroscopic level, the formations in landscape that we anthropomorphize, or that we think we perceive shapes, like here's one of a heart type thing. So usually the arguments against this happening on a macro level is that, it's just, we're getting confused. The shape is not really there. We're just superimposing an image we have in our mind, and we think we're seeing this. Like in this case, this looks like kind of like a bear or something, some kind of animal in the landscape. So, a person could use the same argument on a microscopic level. Oh, we're just anthropomorphizing, it's pareidolia. Now, where that argument breaks down is when you have a uniformity of perception of an occurring phenomena, and also like how often is a structure repeating, both in an individual and in a larger collection of individuals. So when you have uniform things happening, and this affects people from all kinds of different backgrounds, it starts to leave the domain of pareidolia. So I just wanted to bring that up. Now I've thrown in a couple of extra references here I'd like you to check out. So you just scroll down to the bottom. There's a NASA document, a signals intelligence document, that addresses this and claims that they actually have their own method of kind of messing with ideas and emotions in the mind. That's worth checking out. I'm not going to go into all of this stuff right now in detail, but it's important for you to get a grasp of it. I'm just going to read this quote here because I think this is kind of important. I've believed now for a long while that emotions are geographically distributed in terrain and space. When music enjoins the human heart into some mood, some mode, all tone-exposed beings enter the mood currents and share the sentiment. This means that these emotive currents pre-existed the musician. So what he's basically saying there is that a specific emotional state actually exists as an energetic current that a musician simply picks up on with his mind. Now, again, that might sound really controversial and outlandish, but here's the thing. If emotions are magnetic or they're associated to magnetic fields, and that is something that even Dr. Joe Dispenza believes, and this guy has used like state-of-the-art mainstream medical equipment to actually measure fluctuations in the electromagnetic field. And his particular stance is that he thinks that thought is electric and emotion is magnetic. Now, again, why is that important? Well, for those of you that may recall in our group when we studied Professor Callahan's work, Callahan very clearly stated that in the course of his study, he found that the topsoil, the first number of inches in the topsoil, would have different magnetic field strengths from region to region. Certain geographic regions would have greater magnetic field strengths, other regions would have less. And what he found was he was able to correspond the mass emotional tendencies of that region over time, correlating it to the magnetic field strength. So, and he used examples such as those regions where people tended to be more aggressive and had a more warlike history. In other words, there was periodic, times of many decades of, highly violent, aggressive or distressing occurrences happening within the greater society versus areas where they were known to be pacifistic. So certain kinds of Pacific Island areas where there was maybe not so much war, not a lot of violence, people were more mellow, more laid back, not under a lot of distress, did not have a protracted period of history of repeat warfare. I mean, you could certainly say that there were, people living in island areas that did, like New Guinea wouldn't qualify for that. What I'm saying is that apparently in some of the islands where there was a history of passivity, that the magnetic topsoil in aggressive versus passive places was markedly different, and he correlated this across a number of examples. So this is part of what we're dealing with. Now, how does this relate to sound of stars, frequencies technology? Well, right from the get-go, we've made a serious study of this phenomena, and part of this process is actually encoded in our frequencies. That's why over the years, a lot of members have contributed some of the results that they've seen, which has been astounding. We've had some of these go off to proper labs, but after being exposed to sound of stars frequencies, we see physical changes from a diseased state in the blood to a much healthier non-Rouleau state after exposure. And then we also see things like decay being slowed down. This is a really interesting, like a really super interesting account by one of our members. She basically created a highly toxic chamber, and she deposited 2 leaves into these toxic chambers, and one was being treated by frequency, the other wasn't, and it was exposed for the same period of time. So it's very apparent that you can see that the pattern of decay is wildly different. In this one, where there was no frequency applied in the toxic environment, the decay is going throughout the plant, and it has like a greater amount of decay. In the toxic chamber, the decay was pushed right through the very outside of the plant, and the majority of the leaf is retarding the decay. Then we also see things like the acceleration of plants when exposed to sound of stars frequencies. That was a mind blower. And then we also see extremely significant changes in the symmetry and patterning of water exposed to frequencies versus not. So on the left side, you see just water frozen normally. And on the right side, after we exposed water to our frequencies, we got a really different formation there. So that's worth checking out. And part of the reason that we believe this is happening, and just, from my standpoint of research and development, because I know what I'm designing into the frequencies,
it definitely clocks with what we're seeing across the table. And what that means is an eidetic form would be something that it carries information, essentially in the form of of a shape representation of an idea. Um, Now, when I take a look at this one lady's work, uh, she calls it Voice Flowers and the Eidophone. She really came up with some amazing pattern formations. Now, some of you might look at this and go like, oh, it's just a primitive form of kymatics. Uh, there's certainly a connection here with kymatics, but you can't simply classify it as solely the same thing. And the reason that I say that is that there's a quality in the timbre of her voice and the medium that's being used and the process used where you're seeing nuances that you don't see in kymatics. So here's an example. One of the things that would often occur would be like these, what look literally like trees, like growing trees that would result from her voice. And you don't see this kind of shape occurring in kymatics. And then if you take a look at some of her other patterns, we see that there's also a similarity between some of her images and what we've discussed in our group, capillary dynamolysis. I won't go into describing that, but that's another element to be discovered. So I'm going to wrap this up. In the comments section of the link, you will see the hold on a second, the link for this, and I suggest that you spend some time and go over this. Jason Christoph's message was very timely, and I believe he's right about everything he said on his link. So this is a technology that is being likely currently used in a highly negative way, and it's probably being done through the mass media. So they're basically massaging our minds collectively. And by examining this document, we can begin to understand more about how that functions and what can be done about it. Because one of the things with our Sound of Stars frequencies technology is that it purges, as from what we've seen over 15 years, it purges negative emotions, thoughts from the mind. And because we've seen physical state change occurring in things like the blood, halting decay, changing the structure in water, it means that it's an effective tool to use against the negative use of this kind of technology. So I realize this is out there. This is it's both disturbing, but it's also potentially a very joyful realization and a very empowering realization. And I wish that eidetic resonance would have been explored more thoroughly by some of our neighboring communities that are involved in frequency technology applied to healing. But I'm glad that we pursued it, and there's a lot more information to this. I could have put a whole bunch more content into this page. Really what I wanted to do was get a decent summary together so you had a chance to at least get a snapshot of it. So check it out, enjoy that, and let me know your thoughts.